Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to welcome to this radio program writer, activist, intellectual, and historian Robin D.G. Kelley to talk about his book Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. It was first published in 2002. It's now being republished 20 years later. Robin D.G. Kelley is Distinguished Professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. He's the author of a number of other books as well, including Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, and Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class. Robin D.G. Kelley, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks so much, Mitch. I'm a fan of your show, I have to say. I hardly ever miss it.
Oh, no. As you know, some days are better than others, but I think this will be a very good day. And I'm very excited to have this conversation with you.
Yes,
your book, again, Freedom Dreams, published in 2002, being republished now in 2022 with a new foreword and some additional writings in it. Can you compare and contrast the environment in which the book first came out in 2002 and today?
Right. So to think about that moment, it's very precise. This is the end of the Clinton years and the beginning of the Bush years. And as we know in hindsight, the differences weren't that stark. You know, one of the huge differences, of course, was that as I envisioned the book, it was right in the middle of a mass organizing around the murder of Amadou Diallo, which some of your listeners may know was an immigrant from Guinea who was killed by the police in New York City. And a lot of the protests that erupted in New York, in fact, around the country, but especially New York, looked like a kind of miniature version of the George Floyd protest. That is to say, people came out struggling not just against police violence, but other kinds of questions of what causes premature death for Black people. So, that was a huge thing. And it was also a great deal of optimism because those protests were multiracial. They weren't just all Black. And this is a time when New York City was a place to go. If you're a young Black person, you might die because the police were just killing people left and right. And
this is the time of Giuliani.
Exactly, time of Giuliani. And this was also on a national level, this was this transition where you have, George Bush is elected as I'm writing the book. And then as I'm still writing the book, you have the 9/11 attacks and the war in Afghanistan. That was the context. That was the context in which I finished the book. And this was also a moment politically where a lot of young people were kind of torn. I mean, you had people who felt, look, there's no future. Capitalism is just what it is, so I'm going to get paid. And then others like this, I can't see a future. Capitalism is terrible, so we have to end it. How do we do that? And so I'm dealing with these students and dealing with activists and organizers, and introducing them to a lot of the movements that emerged in the late 80s and 90s that in fact were arrayed against Clinton neoliberalism, that were, in fact, fighting some of the same fights that we are fighting today: anti-immigrant racism, reparations, neoliberalism, police violence, reproductive justice. That was an issue. So fast forward, you go from this moment of possibility, the backlash, the war on terror, and then after the book comes out, the struggles around the war in Iraq and all that, to 2020, spring 2020, when I'd been thinking about putting out a new edition of Freedom Dreams for a while, but spring 2020 was really the catalyst for thinking about the ways in which those same struggles continued, how much there was a kind of, on one hand, a kind of deja vu, looking at like a scaling up of the Amadou Diallo moment in the streets around the country and around the world against state violence, which again is the opening for other kinds of struggles. And then the backlash that comes after that. And so I think there is, there's some differences, definitely, in terms of not just scale, but also in terms of the way that these struggles or visions of freedom have really expanded, have, in which you have queer leadership and feminist leadership of these organizations that were once considered to be like the core of these social movements. Disability justice, emerging as really, really important central struggles for a socialist future, right? So it's not just about inclusivity. What you see is a broader, more radical vision of what's possible in a moment when it looks like fascism, as we've known it, is more imminent than ever, at least the last 70, 80 years, So there's this interesting moment in dynamic that we're in right now. And I'm not saying that the book is necessarily like the answer of the risk. In fact, I go against that argument. But to suggest that, we're in this critical moment where politically, those radical movements that erupted in spring 2020 are being told, you know what, you got to be pragmatic. Stop talking about defunding the police. We've got to get Biden elected. We've got to stop Trump. So therefore, tamp down that talk, tamp down those freedom dreams. And I think this is one of the huge, I wouldn't call it a mistake, because not everyone abided by that, but it was, it was telling for why we actually need to remind ourselves why we join these movements in the first place, why they erupt, what they're struggling for, what kind of new world are we trying to create? Or are we trying to simply put Band-Aids on the liberal world that has given us so much pain and anguish?
I mean, it seems in a way that is what has happened. I mean, you had Amazon suddenly putting out Black Lives Matter. You'd watch a baseball game on the pitcher's mound in the back would say BLM hashtag, and
Right.
and you saw corporate America sort of talking this talk in the aftermath of spring 2020.
That's absolutely right. And and this is also another important lesson in how quickly what could be understood or produced as a kind of radical vision could be appropriated. And again, we saw this in 2020. We saw it at the end of the 90s, where I kind of deal with this, but it's not really a central theme, where liberal multiculturalism, which initially wasn't so liberal. It was actually trying to rewrite the narrative of the United States and the world, and also trying to fight to dismantle the structures of sexism, patriarchy, and racism. And this becomes instead a kind of new realignment. That is, politically, how do you get people who are brown, Black, female, queer, into spaces of power to do the bidding of capital, to do the bidding of militarism, to do the bidding of what becomes a climate catastrophe. And we see this, we're seeing this right now. And what's interesting is, despite the fact that liberal multiculturalism itself is not really a threat to power, as we speak, and as you know this because you've talked about this, the whole argument against so-called critical race theory, I say so-called because it's what they're fighting is not critical race theory, but liberal multiculturalism. But the whole argument about wokeness is really pressing down on a liberal idea, that is inclusion without changing the status quo. So now the right is like, we don't even want inclusion. We don't even want you to change the narrative a little bit, because that is considered dangerous. Why? It's not because the people who advocate for these new laws and who are trying to shut down sort of liberal multicultural education, not that they even believe this. They are building a base around fascism, around a racist fascism, which is convincing a lot of white people, not all of them, thank goodness, but convincing a lot of white people, especially white working people, that your misery is tied to the success of these people of color and of women and of trans people. It's tied to their rights. And the more rights they get, the less you get. And what they're doing is they're taking over the country. We need to take it back. Of course, they never had it. The white working class has never had this country. That's a tragedy. They think they did. They have been extracted from and exploited the same, to the same degree, essentially. But that doesn't really matter. What matters is that they're even pushing back against liberalism to support a kind of fascist turn, to crush, through incorporation, crush white working people. And so when we talk about freedom dreams and the point of the book, one of the things I don't deal with, but I think is worth thinking about is, that's not true. I deal with it a little bit. That is that many of the freedom dreams that emerged out of Black liberation movements from the left, surrealism, Black feminism, have always been expansive enough to open the doors for freedom for all. That was the whole point of freedom dreams. The whole point was that whether it's a struggle for reparations, a struggle for communism, a struggle for, the end patriarchy, racist patriarchy, every single one of them envisioned a world in which the oppressions of all people would be eliminated, and that's a tragedy. So imagine you're pitting so-called anti-wokeness fascism against freedom dreams, against liberatory dreams that say the state should be something that could solve people's problems, that medical care should not be something you pay for, that no one should go hungry, that everyone should have some place to live, that we can find new ways to be together as a community, right? And that's the freedom dreams multiple, plural, that actually drive this book and the possibility of something different.
You very much piqued my interest when you said that they are not fighting against critical race theory, but liberal multiculturalism. Can you distinguish between those two for me?
Sure. Yeah, no, critical race theory actually is a legal, I don't call it a doctrine, but a mode of analysis that comes out of law that basically asks the fundamental question. That is, how is it we can get all this legislation passed that is supposed to protect people from racism, like, from the 14th Amendment to the Civil Rights Act to the Voting Rights? How can we have these things and racism still persists? And so the argument is that as lawyers, as legal scholars, we can't always look at legislation and policy as the explanation or even the form of power that could solve the problem. You have to look elsewhere. So critical race theory says, look, you need to look at other structures of power, including ideological structures. That is the way that people think. What's the common sense? And that's it. It's not something that's necessarily taught in elementary school, but maybe it should be. I don't know. Now, liberal multiculturalism basically says America is fundamentally a good place. We have a constitutional republic. That constitution was designed to make sure that in the long run, we'd have fairness, some level of, I wouldn't call it equity, but certainly equal opportunity, that the negative, we'd have sort of negative liberties. That is to say, freedoms not to have things suppressed, like the right to free speech, the right to privacy, this sort of thing. So that America is fundamentally good, but it has practiced these exclusionary actions, right, over the years. And in excluding, we've missed out the great diversity of America. So what liberal multiculturalism does is that, look, we're just going to add some more stories to the American story. And we're going to show, A, how those other people who've been excluded actually benefit from the American story, and how they've shaped the American story. So there's certain stories that will never be in a liberal multicultural story. I've never seen liberal multiculturalism tell the story of the Communist Party, for example. It's just they're not there. But you can certainly have even someone as radical as Frederick Douglass, becomes incorporated in because he would be presented as someone who upholds the American dream of freedom and liberty, right? So in a sense, liberal multiculturalism does not change the status quo. It is simply diversity practice. Diversity practice is the same as a corporate practice. We like our boardrooms. We just need to integrate them. We like the state. We just need to get a Black president. What they don't want is the dismantling of these structures. And that's what liberal multiculturalism protects against, right? And those are fundamentally the differences between the two. I mean, the irony is that critical race theory is more dangerous, is more radical. It's not to say that it doesn't have its elements of liberalism, but it does suggest that we can't go forward without a fundamental transformation of society. I mean, that is the difference. Liberal multiculturalism is not asking for that. They're asking for diversity.
Anti-woke racism, another term you mentioned earlier, is interesting. And I do think of Tucker Carlson and his show, and oftentimes they do sort of put together the anti-woke sentiment and anger at corporate America today, right, that is, right, promoting multicultural liberalism or liberal multiculturalism. But it's just not on the right. You find that as well. I think there is elements within the left that say concentration of quote unquote woke culture means that we are ignoring more class based kind of struggles and what's really important.
You hit the problem on the head, as always. You're absolutely right. And in fact, this contest between what's called class reductionism and race reductionism, which I think is a false contest altogether, but this idea coming from the left, and I've actually written about this in my book, Your Mama's Dysfunctional, back in the 90s. So it's not even a new phenomenon. But this notion coming from a particular sort of segment of the Marxist left says the more we talk about race, the less we talk about class. Race gets in the way. And all these movements for that are based on what's considered to be identity politics undermine class solidarity. And so what we need to do is talk about what makes us alike, what makes us similar. Don't spend so much talking about, queer liberation, Black liberation. That stuff is wrong. And so in many ways, back in the 90s, and we can see it reflected today, there was a movement afoot to bring back the Enlightenment. And by Enlightenment, there was some confusion about which Enlightenment. There's always confusion. But the idea was that there's certain things that are universal and things that are particular. So we need to bring back and emphasize the universal, and that the universal are things like, the way that capitalism oppresses everybody by stripping huge swaths of communities from access to means of production and leaving them with nothing but the ability to sell their wages, sell their labor for wages. And that's really the fundamental question. And of course, there's pushback to that, which is to say, there's a history, even among the left, even within revolutionary situations, in which, racism, sexism, patriarchy continue to exist within those organizations, within those movements, let alone within the vision or the manifestos of those movements that are trying to build a new world. And and this gets down to the core issue, the core debate is whether or not, this is an old debate, whether or not the socialist utopia would automatically lead to racism, sexism, patriarchy, transphobia, all that would just sort of disappear because the material basis for those kinds of oppressions would disappear. That's a particular kind of narrow Marxist argument. The other is that it's not going to disappear. One, because it preceded capitalism, and two, because even we could see within social societies when they try to build new forms of equality and equity, that racism and sexism are deeply ingrained. It's not just ingrained in the mind. It's not about changing minds. It's also structural. In fact, it's primarily structural. And that is the issue. So this brings us to, I was just having this debate recently about what does it mean to build a class movement in a world in which racism, sexism continue to persist? Like, how do you do that? And one of the arguments I was trying to make was that, let me back up. There's a lot of folks who believe that if you say words like white supremacy, if you bring up structural racism, that it's going to alienate white people, so don't bring it up. That the movement is too important. You don't want to split people. But my argument is that if white people could understand how they are oppressed by patriarchy and racism, the ways in which they function to make life more miserable for them, then they're going to understand that fighting white supremacy is not only in their interest, but it's a matter of survival. You cannot fight capitalism without fighting the colonial basis for capitalism. You can't fight capitalism without fighting white supremacy. You can't fight capitalism without fighting sexism and patriarchy. You can't fight capitalism without fighting homophobia, transphobia, and all that. In fact, you can't fight capitalism without fighting nationalism, because these are the pillars upon which capitalism emerged. So it's to me, it's not even a debate. It's a false debate, because no one has time to reduce anything to class or race. We have to understand the whole structure of capitalism as a civilization, as something much greater than the means of production and surplus value. It's much bigger than that. And we have to fight a much bigger fight. And again, we come back to freedom dreams. The dream of liberation in all levels and all aspects of life for all peoples, which is the dream of the Combahee River Collective, emerged in the Boston area with Barbara Smith and that dream, based on their vision of identity politics, that is to say that everyone has an identity in relationship to structures of power, that is a dream that could possibly liberate the whole.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Robin D.G. Kelley, who's a distinguished professor, and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at University of California, Los Angeles. We are in conversation about his book, which has been republished from 2002, now out again, called Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. I think this is an interesting segue then into something I was hoping to talk about specifically about your book, a chapter I very much enjoyed spending time with, and that was chapter number 2, which was called The Negro Question, Red Dreams of Black Liberation. This is a chapter, and it's a fascinating story, and it's not told in many other places, maybe other places, but not told widely, about the communist movement in the first half of the 20th century and black people, particularly black Americans who were involved in that, and black immigrants too, who were involved in that. Tell me about the importance. And I would just say you yourself, not in the early 20th century, but in the later half of the 20th century for a short period of time, was a member of the Communist Worker Party.
Right. Exactly. And this is where I should just confess that this book is really autobiographical. It sort of marks my own journey from being a Black nationalist to being a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, to being, of course, shaped by thorough liberation movements, to be pulled into Black feminism and into surrealism. Not to say that I left any of those things behind. They come with me. But this
But you
particular
find
chapter
this
is a
own transformation for you through the history of what happened sort
yes,
of in the 20th century?
exactly. I mean, that's why the chapters are very personal. They're things that I have felt like I've studied and experienced both in terms of providing new energies, but also revealing contradiction. But that's what happens to all of us. I mean, that's just life. And it's interesting because that chapter brought me back to my doctoral dissertation, which was on the Communist Party in Alabama, which became my first book, Hammer and Hoe. But what I try to do in this chapter was to think not so much about movement on the ground, but ideas. And that is the ideas that Black intellectuals brought to the Communist Party in its earlier iterations, from Claude Mckay to Claudia Jones, from W.B. Du Bois. Of course, C.L.R. James wasn't in the Communist Party, but he was a Marxist. He was involved with the Trotskyist movement for a while, then broke, actually for a long while, then broke from that. And in many ways was in the debates on the question of what was then called the Negro Question. And just to give you, for readers, a sense, the Negro Question is this thing that had been around the modern left really since the 19th century, at least. And that is, what do we do with the Negro? As if the Negro, Black people, are the object. The Negro Question in the 19th century was about what to do with the slave. And of course, I mean, Marx gets a bad rap unfairly. I think people will talk about his blind spots and stuff, but if you really read Marx carefully, including his writing in New York Tribune, he was deeply anti-slavery in a way that a lot of people were not. He understood the importance of emancipation to generate new movements that really could emancipate the working class as a whole. And I don't want to get into that, but that's another story. But fundamentally, the Negro Question has been haunting the left. The Communist Party is different from the socialists at that point because it's one of the first, it is the first 20th century movement that tried to center the question of Black liberation. I mean, from its inception. I mean, and this is important because the fact that the Communist International was having these meetings, these international meetings, first, second, third, fourth, and inviting Black revolutionaries from South Africa, from the United States, from all over, to basically debate the question of Black freedom and debate the question of socialism and debate the question of what Communist Party should be doing. So in many ways, even though the Communist Party gets a bad rap unfairly, it is probably the most attuned to what was considered Negro Question. What I argue in this chapter is that figures like Claudia Jones and Paul Robeson and Du Bois and others, Claude Mckay, Richard Wright, they brought to the party a different vision than what the party understood the Negro Question to be. They went from being objects to subjects, from being the problem to the solution. And that is what I try to argue here, and it wasn't taken up. And so what ends up happening, you see Black intellectuals who are at the forefront of anti-fascism, for example, who understood, for example, that fascism's roots were in colonialism and slavery. They were making an argument before leaders of the CP were making an argument. They weren't making that argument. These are the same folks who, during the Cold War, people like William L. Patterson and certainly Du Bois and Robeson, were making arguments for reparations, making arguments, that the history of the United States is a history of anti-Black genocide, connecting police violence and lynching as state-sanctioned violence, and saying that part of the struggle is to end that and to bring in international institutions like the United Nations, into that. This was where the Black left was in the post-war period. Oftentimes we think of the post-war period as this dark times of HUAC and the crushing of the left, but there was a visionary movement that erupted in the 1940s and 50s, one that I would argue, or I do argue, was far more emancipatory than what the party's main core line was. And in fact, far more emancipatory than many of the things that emerged after that, but we have to go back and look and study them to really understand what it meant. And finally, the last thing is that I try to struggle with the disconnect between the Southern Freedom Movement that emerged in the same period and the liberatory dreams of the National Negro Congress and the Paul Robesons, the William L. Pattersons, the Claudia Jones, who imagined if their ideas were the driving force behind the Southern Freedom Movement, and to be fair, some of them were, they just were suppressed. Imagine what the civil rights movement would have looked like, how different it might have been,
There was a split.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's part of what happens is the Cold War crushes some of those radical visionaries within the civil rights movement. Not all of them, some of them.
And we see this with the NAACP as well, don't we? Between a sort of power struggle, I guess, between Walter Jones and W.B. Du Bois.
Yes. We see a struggle between Du Bois, who ends up drafting the NAACP statement before the United Nations, calling for investigation, recognizing genocide before genocide was even circulating as a major idea, and then Walter White,
forgive me.
Right. Oh no, Walter White, who himself is anti-communist, has a long history of anti-communism, and also very jealous of Du Bois. They actually end up, I don't want to make this about personalities, but they split in many ways. And there's another story to tell, which the history of the NAACP is being written, continue to be written as we go along. Because to be fair to someone like Walter White, the NAACP did try in the post-war period to intervene on this question of colonialism and on national independence of the formerly colonized nations in Africa and Caribbean and Latin America. But they were not willing to go as far as the Robesons and the Du Bois. And unfortunately, HUAC did play a role in silencing or trying to silence W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, taking their passports, basically turning segments of the Black middle class leadership against them. And that was a great tragedy. Because imagine, of course, now in 2022, people like Lorraine Hansberry, Louise Thompson Patterson, Shirley Graham Du Bois, these are people that we can think of now as kind of heroic, as really important. But you got to understand what it meant in the 50s and early 60s for their names to be persona non grata, and the loss that entailed.
Langston Hughes was a leader of a communist party.
Yes,
something Langston that's Hughes also not well remembered today.
It is not. Langston Hughes was very active on the edges. I mean, he was very active in the League of Struggle for, I think it's called League of Revolutionary Struggle for the Negro. He was involved directly. His poetry, his activism. Of course, he spent time in the Soviet Union, wrote about it, but he also suffered from the Cold War. And in fact, he had to tamp down his own political criticisms in the 1950s for his own survival. And that's something to really remember. I mean, some people make a distinction between the Langston Hughes of the 30s and the Langston Hughes of the 50s and until he dies in 67. But it's the same Langston Hughes. It's the same one who actually believed in sort of three major things. One, he actually believed in class struggle, that the class, needs to become a class for itself to win. Two, that he believed that Black people, Black artists, should be able to say and do whatever the hell they want to do. That is to say, they don't have to conform to any particular line, but have the intellectual freedom and political freedom to take a stance. And the third thing that he did was he had a love for the vernacular language of Black people, and he was able to turn that into political art in a way that very few artists have been able to do, with the exception of people like Zora Neale Hurston and others much later. So those are the things that really make Langston Hughes like a unique figure. And when you go back to his work, it feels so contemporary to this day.
And Black women are also a part of this story. Somebody who worked closely with Langston Hughes, who I had not heard of until I read her name in your book, was Louise Thompson.
Yes, Louise Thompson Patterson. She's an interesting person. There's a book in progress that will come out eventually about her life. Imagine she's someone who was a significant young educator, a figure in the Harlem Renaissance. She was the one responsible for bringing a contingent of Black writers, intellectuals, and artists and actors to the Soviet Union, initially to do this movie called Black and White. This Soviet-made movie never was made. And that's partly how Langston Hughes got there in the first place. Langston and Louise were very tight. She also went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War and wrote about it. She ends up marrying William L. Patterson, who was probably the highest ranking Black person in the Communist Party USA. And though she never officially kind of joined the party, I mean, she was in it, but not in it in a way of kind of leadership position. She was sort of in it. She was one of the most significant intellectuals of the 20th century, both writing about art, politics, and women's power.
Does the Soviet Union play a role in this history?
Yes, it does play a role. I mean, in that chapter and elsewhere, the chapter that follows, which is about third world liberation movements, I mean, whatever limitations the Soviet Union might have conveyed or displayed, I should say, it was the space for utopian dreaming, especially if you didn't know much of what was going on inside of it. What you knew was workers rose up and took power. They started out in Soviets and they transformed the Soviets into national power. They were one of the biggest supporters of anti-colonial movements, not just in the 50s and 60s, but in the 30s. The Soviet Union funded the League Against Imperialism, for example. They supported anti-imperialist movements. They were underwriting some of the journals like the Negro Worker, which were pushing for anti-colonial politics in the 1930s. By the time we get to the post-war period in the post-Pan-African Congress in Manchester, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, you have erupting liberation movements, guerrilla movements that are being funded by the Soviets. That's a huge thing. I mean, if you're trying to win a war against colonial powers, those same colonial powers who were allies of the Soviet Union during World War II, remember that, then you need whatever resources and support you can get. And it's not coming from the United States, So in many ways, yeah, exactly. The U.S. is funding and actually participating in military operations against those movements. So in that sense, the Soviet Union does play an outsized role in this, story. And the space of the Soviet Union, the space of the Communist International becomes the debating ground for how Black and African in particular, and brown and indigenous communists should proceed. They're having these debates. M.N. Roy from the Communist Party in India, debating Lenin on national liberation. I mean, the fact that you actually have a platform where Claude Mckay could give a presentation on the need to support radical nationalist, independent, autonomous movements like Garveyism, for example. These are the things that made a difference. There was no platform within the Democratic Party in the United States for Black radicals to come and say, this is what we think,
Claude Mckay is a name that has come up a few times now. Who was he?
Claude Mckay was a Jamaican poet, writer, novelist, activist, very close to the Communist Party, though he never really was a member per se. He was actually active at one point in the African Blood Brotherhood, which was one of the independent autonomous organizations that helped bring about the Black presence in the Communist Party. It's a very, very good biography of Mckay by Winston James that just came out not long ago. So I suggest that. But he was someone who, like I said, was very independent as an artist. I mean, I think his he never really got the recognition as a radical that he really deserved. And he was someone also whose novels really captured the internationalism of both the kind of Black communist insurgency, but also its limits. He's written about the campaign to defend Ethiopia from the Italian invasion in this really quite hilarious novel just recently discovered and published, and called Amiable with Big Teeth. And then he's also written about the kind of waterfront workers in Marseille, this multiracial in the 1930s, of these kind of active, really Pan-African, quite radical, both intellectuals and workers, and just what that culture looked like. So he was someone who I think, really deserves, a rethinking in a new look.
Third World Liberation Front is something more recent, I think, in our collective memory. People still alive today who were a part of that. Is it, thinking back to the first half of the 20th century, should we see Black communist movement as a precursor to that, as leading to what we'd get later?
Yes, I would agree with that. That in many ways, though Black internationalism itself is very old, it took on a particular valence in the 1920s and 30s. So I would say two things. One is that the Communist Party is one place where there's a precursor for that because of the kinds of international structures that allowed for travel, debate, engagement across these national lines. But then there's another side to it. That is, there's the anti-communist left, the anti-Stalinist left, I should say, not the anti-communist, but the anti-Stalinist left, centered around people like C.L.R. James and others who formed, and George Padmore, who formed groups like the International African Service Bureau. And they're based in London, and they're also connected with other movements around the world that are also laying the foundations for what becomes a kind of third world radicalism as well. One of the pitfalls, and this is very specific to Soviet history, is that the internationalist vision of the 1930s that was tied to the Communist Party and to Black people in it was derailed in many ways by a particular kind of anti-fascism that promoted the notion of socialism within one country in defending the Soviet Union at all costs. Now, if I
Sort
were
of
living
the
in those
split with
times,
Stalin. Is
yeah,
this the
yes,
split with
exactly.
Stalin?
This
I
is
mean, it
basically,
haunts the left up to this day.
oh yeah, and as it should, and we should take lessons from that. And I think some of the lessons, because of course this is the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which your listeners may know this, but basically was an agreement between Hitler and the Soviets to basically say, look, for the time being, we're going to do a non-aggression treaty. You don't invade us, we won't enter this war and fight you. And everyone knew it was temporary. And but it's seen as such a betrayal and all this other stuff. But if you're living in that moment, and if you believe, and this has to do with perspective. If you're an internationalist who believes that internationalism's survival depends on the survival of the Soviet Union, then you're going to go for that. You're going to support that. It's a reasonable position to take. If you don't believe that internationalism depends on the survival of the Soviet Union, then what you will do is you'll say, we're going to fight fascism no matter where it is. We're not going to spend our time upholding the Soviets, but rather we're going to fight it where it is. And so we're going to go to Spain and we're going to fight it there. We're going to go to Ethiopia, we're going to fight it there. We're going to fight it everywhere, hoping that the future is not socialism in one country, but socialism around the world. Now, of course, some listeners like, oh, you're a Trotskyist, why? Show what's wrong with you? I'm not any of those things. I'm just laying out what were the debates. And, and this is very important because why is the Soviet Union important? Because it was among some elements of those who broke from Trotsky, like C.L.R. James, who came to the conclusion that the Soviet Union is not some deformed worker state. It is not a worker state at all. The Soviet Union could have been, but it became a state capitalist, institution. It became state capitalism, but one that is in the name of working people, but not really for their benefit. So that's the point where a particular segment of the left said, you know what, we're not doing any of this. Now, third world liberation, let's make a connection here. One of the possible tragedies of third world liberation movements, which I don't talk about in the book, is the limits of nationalism. Part of what these movements were trying to do was create socialism in one state. That is to say, to fight for their freedom, fight for independence within the nation state form. But once you do that, you're limited. You're limited in terms of how you govern. You're limited in terms of resources available to you. And then it produces certain kinds of possibilities for other kinds of nationalisms, whether it's in the Congo, where one segment is trying to succeed in the Katanga region because that's where the mineral wealth is and it's supported by the United States and others, or in Nigeria, where another segment is trying to succeed, again, around oil wealth in the Biafra War. Nationalism is a very dangerous thing. It may serve a certain kind of a mobilization power, and the state certainly is important to be able to become a redistributive force. But ultimately, it's very hard to have this continent of Africa, for example, broken up into all these different states with borders, boundaries, laws, and rules and regulations. And that's where, again, in terms of third world dreaming, there was a dream on the part of people like Kwame Nkrumah that says, we want one United States of Africa. We don't want the nation state as we know it. And Aimé Césaire, we don't want the nation state as we know it. Leopold Senghor, we don't want the nation state as we know it. We want something bigger. We want to turn the old Commonwealth into a socialist Commonwealth. And that is still, to this day, a debate that we're having,
Hence freedom dreams and the idea of dreaming and the importance of dreaming.
Exactly.
Robin D.G. Kelley has been our guest. He has joined us to talk about his book, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, which is being republished this year after being written originally 20 years ago. He is also Distinguished Professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at UCLA. Professor Kelley, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. It's always a pleasure.